Good evening. Congratulations to all of you who lasted this long. We assume we're not going to need the overflow room, but this is a large crowd still. So this is no longer Surrogacy 101. This is no longer the introductory class for surrogacy, but now we're going into graduate level class, master class. And what we would like to try to do at this session is to allow you to start understanding a little more about the parts of the costs associated with surrogacy that are not that predictable. So remember, we spoke about it yesterday, and I would like to start by introducing the document that you have as the handout. Everybody has this document? That we, as an organization, wanted to try to decipher, try to understand better the costs associated with surrogacy. So if you have some sort of other medical treatment, for instance, that you need to worry about, first of all, if you live in a decent country, it doesn't cost you anything. But otherwise, you can just go and ask, how much is it? Here, this is a process that involves various different service providers and various different people who are helping you, at least two, a surrogate and an egg donor. And they all have expenses and various ways to be compensated and appreciated. So not only that, but things could develop in more than one way. There could be a lot of forks along the road where one thing could happen or the other, so so it's not that predictable. So the first thing usually that happens to an intended parent or intended parents when they start this process is that they go to speak to one of these providers and ask them, how much do you think this will cost me? And the reputable and ethical ones will do their best, try to assess how much it's going to cost, but all they can do typically is quote you what they have control over. At the very least, the agency is not going to know how much the clinic's going to charge. The clinic's not going to know, how much the agency and the surrogate are going to end up costing you. And they also don't have the strongest incentive, not to say that they're bad people, but they never had the need to spend the hours and hours and hours we did to try to research this and find out what the average costs are of a lot of these cost items. So, and also they don't want you to get a sticker shock, quite frankly. A sticker shock is when somebody sees the price of something and says, that's too much for me, and decides not to do it at all. What we had to do is that since we have people we help with the assistance program, and we'll talk about that a little more afterwards if you have questions, and we spoke about it yesterday. When we have like almost 20 couples like we have in this year that we have to help throughout the whole process, we need to know how much it's going to cost, because those components that are not given for free, we need to pay for and we need to budget for. So that's why about, I think now 3 years ago at least, we took cost sheets, or 3 or 4 years ago, we took the cost sheets of, at the time I think 30 agencies and clinics, and we said, let's try to see what's common among them. Let's try to see what are the components. We didn't even know how to break it down to different sections, to come up with a structure that makes sense, to come up with terminology. Everybody calls something, some of those components differently. People sometimes have, one price, a flat fee for some a bundle of expenses. Some other times they itemize it. They give you different components. So we had to try to first decipher that. So we came up with this system that you have here. It is explained in the first 2 pages, and we had to use even colors because the reality is that a lot of those things, it was like, it depends, or sometimes like this, sometimes like that. So those colors help you understand. Some of those, for instance, the items in green mean that we expect those items, but those items sometimes are bundled into a flat fee. The blue ones, for instance, mean that they're not always necessary, and not always, that don't always occur. And the pink ones, I think, or whatever, the dark orange one, Are something that are typically, in this case, it's actually not applicable, but when we do it for a particular provider, it means that they don't provide that. But here, when it says third party, that means that even in the IVF section, for instance, some prices like the cost of the blood tests, the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration's required blood tests, those $750, for instance, on the second page, that's something that the clinics don't collect. It's a third party. It's something that the clinics many times will not necessarily inform you about, or even if they inform you about it, they don't collect it. So a few general comments about this. This is the United States, not Canada. This is 2 sheets that are half. Each of them is only part of the process. So sheet number 1 is for the agency and the surrogate related costs. Sheet number 2 is for the egg donor and the clinic. So in each one of those sheets, we have 3 columns. The first column has the prices that, or the costs associated that are typically the lowest end. The second column are the reasonable maximum or higher end. Sometimes those things go off the chart, but the reasonable maximum. And the third one is not the average, but the most likely, or the one that is reasonable in not in many cases, and that adds up at $85,000 for the first part, and $43,000 for the second part. Okay, so what is it? Almost $130,000. That even doesn't include what we call contingencies. It means that if you are successful the first time, if you don't have twins, if you don't have unusual insurance costs, that's how much it is likely to cost you. Okay? You can control a lot of it the way in ways we discussed yesterday, to try to do the cost-saving best practices we mentioned yesterday that you still probably have in your handouts. We'll talk about maybe some of them here. But those contingencies include sometimes another IVF transfer at the very least. Sometimes even, some circumstances, another round of IVF if you run out of embryos. So by now you probably all have heard or thought about some of those things, but I just want to explain how to read this document. What I do suggest, since there's not going to be a test at the end of the conference, is that you don't try to study this or master that, but use it as a checklist. When you go to the service providers, at the very least ask them what the cost they expect in those line items. At the very least, it would maybe help them think of things they didn't think of when they first mentioned the costs to you. So use it at the very least as a checklist. If you want this in an Excel sheet format, as a blank Excel sheet, if you want to, those of you who are into this, and I probably would have if at the time if anybody gave me something like this. We have it at the MHB Facebook group in the files. So we have a blank Excel sheet like that, and we have this in the digital format as well. And when we update this soon, probably, we will have that update there as well. So that's just as by way of introduction to how to use this document and how we created it. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of items here that are not provided or not attained by just averaging or looking across the board of all the providers. Some of those are assessments of typical travel costs, typical childcare costs. And those are things that are not controlled by the agencies necessarily. And those are things we also used other experts or people in the field. We polled them to say, what do you think is reasonable? What have you heard about? And we'll try to update them as things change. But really, the only thing that has changed significantly in the last few years is the actual base compensation of the surrogates. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the purpose of this panel is not to go over all of this, but to just concentrate on what, as I mentioned, is the part that is not as easily quoted by the agencies and the clinics, which is the surrogate's compensation and associated costs, including the costs associated with medical insurance. So this is what we're going to do for the rest of the now only 50 minutes, sorry, we have left. So, but I promise not to shut up for the most part, and say that the last thing I want to mention, because sometimes we also have a surrogate on the panel, we don't have it today, is that I want you to just remember what we think the base compensation for the surrogates is for. And it is, in our understanding and our interpretation, the base compensation is justified because the surrogate's life is going to be disrupted by this process, her life and the life of her entire family, that she will go through much physical discomfort. Sometimes in legal terms, people call it pain and suffering. We thought that sounded a little extreme, especially if the surrogates are well screened. It shouldn't be that bad. And the last thing is the medical risk. So a surrogate needs to be compensated for those things, but the surrogate also should not be out of pocket for anything that costs or loss of income that she incurs, which is why there's this range of cost components. So we will start with Vicky. You all met by now from Worldwide Surrogacy, and we would like you to talk about what is it beyond the base compensation that is in this in this usual package that is beyond just the base compensation.
Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. I'm sure it's been a long couple of days, but it's great that you're still getting your information. So in your contract with your surrogate, well, first of all, there will be a contract with your surrogate, and that contract will be your roadmap, and it will have all of the line items that you would be possibly expected to pay to your surrogate. So Ron mentioned the base compensation, that will be in there. So for argument's sake, call it $35,000. That $35,000 is what you would pay during the pregnancy, starting with the confirmation of pregnancy, and then maybe 10 equal installments of $3,500. Other things go into the contract, and you have a good guide here of different things that might go into your contract, but there'll be things like a payment for the embryo transfer, a payment for maternity clothing, certain things that might happen during the pregnancy, like if she undergoes a cesarean section, there would be a payment for her for that, invasive medical procedures. So there are different line items that can add up. Lost wages is a possibility. Lost wages, everything should be capped in your contract, I believe. So lost wages should be capped. Sometimes it's $6,000, sometimes it's $10,000. So your lawyer who's helping you with the contract should be able to guide you on what those caps should be, so that you should be able to add up everything in the contract and know exactly what your exposure is. So your exposure might be to $50,000 if you added up every dollar in the contract. But maybe you don't pay all of that. Maybe if you're having a single baby, it's likely that she'll have a healthy pregnancy, and maybe she doesn't lose that much time from work. So if your lost wages cap is $10,000, you might not pay all of that. You might only pay $2,000 in lost wages because she doesn't go on bed rest and she has a healthy, normal pregnancy. So as you work on your contract with your lawyer, you should be able to see all of these line items in very clear, itemized way, and be able to know what you might be expected to pay. And it's very standard, actually. There shouldn't be any big surprises in a contract. Surrogates are online, they're in chat rooms, they're on forums, so they share information with each other. So there shouldn't be, and there normally isn't, a big difference in compensation between, say, Florida and Ohio, or Texas and Colorado. It's all going to be fairly standard. The only thing is maybe we do see some higher compensation to surrogates in California, That's just something that is an anomaly. But basically, you should be in the realm of a standard form of compensation, varying to some degrees based on the surrogate, based on her experience, based on what she earns in her job. But it should be something that, if you were talking to me, I would be able to say, this is what to expect, and most likely that is what you'll see. So.
Before we continue, let me just, I was just thinking of a few things that you might have said, and if I was in the audience 20 years ago, before becoming a parent, I would not have understood. When you said, for instance, a payment for the transfer, you don't mean the payment for the medical cost of the transfer. Why is that not part of the base compensation?
Okay, so that's a good point. We're not talking about the medical fee. That would be separate. That would be paid through your IVF clinic. We're talking about something extra to her because she's going through an extra procedure. She's going through an invasive medical procedure that leads to more discomfort, more interruption in her life. She's actually traveling to the clinic for that. So in addition to the base compensation, there are these additional payments to her for the things that she's going through. For example, the C-section, that could be a payment of $3,000. That's major surgery. So as opposed to a vaginal birth, a woman who goes through a C-section has to recover from a major surgery.
So in other words, it's not part of basic compensation because she could have more than one transfer.
That's right. She could have more than one transfer.
Oh, okay. And she doesn't always have a cesarean section, etc. So those things are extra. And if she has a payment for the transfer, it doesn't mean that she doesn't also have her expenses associated with the transfer paid for, which would include what?
Travel costs. If she travels to a long-distance clinic, there'll be a plane flight, a domestic flight. There'd be some hotel costs. So that you can expect if your surrogate doesn't live near your clinic. But other things in the contract, like you might see a line item for loss of reproductive organs, maybe $5,000 if she has to undergo surgery when she gives birth and loses her uterus or fallopian tubes. Now that might happen, but it usually doesn't. So that's a line item in your contract that you're going to see, but most likely it's a very small risk that you would have to pay that.
So once again, just to decipher that, loss of reproductive organs. That means if something happens, and it does sometimes, and she has some rupture or something during birth. We just had a GPAP couple that had their surrogate really have that. Our surrogate had that. So if something happens, especially with twins, and she cannot be pregnant again, she gets an extra compensation. That's, in legal terms, loss of reproductive organs or production organs. So, and so what other circumstances, twins, bed rest, can you just get into those a little bit? That doesn't
So twins would warrant an additional payment, maybe $5,000. So if your base compensation is $35,000, you would add $5,000 if she has twins. The lost wages we talked about. Other line items could be other invasive medical procedures. If you would like to have an amniocentesis, which is a test to look for abnormalities in the fetus, that's an invasive medical procedure that could warrant another payment to her of $500. There's some payments for insurance. If she doesn't have insurance for the maternity, then you would be expected to pay the premiums for medical insurance, and that I'm sure we'll get into later on this panel. There's a payment for life insurance. It's not huge. Usually in the US we can get life insurance for approximately $50 per month, but that is another component to your contract.
Terrific. Moving on, thank you, Vicky. Sam Hyde from Circle Surrogacy, you probably all remember him as well. So when we look at this, I wanted to first maybe explain to people the dynamics of how these payments are made. Of course, they know that at some point they might need to write a check or give their credit card to pay the professionals, the agency, the clinic, etc. But when it comes to paying for all these, other costs, how is that done? Do they pay one by one each cost, or do they pay as they come, or can you first talk about that and then we'll.
Yeah, great question. So I think that this varies a little bit agency by agency. I think most agencies take the approach of having the payment done in 2 or 3 tranches. So an initial payment up front that is essentially a retainer, where the agency will then go find a surrogate for you, help you match, help you do the egg donor journey if you need to as well. And then usually a second tranche or a second payment at the time you match with the surrogate, and that covers. At that point, most agencies collect, and Vicky, you should correct me if you do it differently, but we collect at that point all the compensation that the surrogate will earn throughout the journey, all the fees associated with any insurance that needs to be put in place as an estimate, all the travel fees that we anticipate for the surrogate traveling back and forth from the clinic. We also take a small portion to set aside for contingencies in case she does need a C-section or something like that. We put those aside at the beginning as well. And then occasionally, depending on what IVF clinic we work with, we'll also collect the fees for the IVF clinic, and then we'll pay the IVF clinic directly for you. So, and then occasionally at the end, as we do parentage work, the legal work at the end to establish your legal rights as parents, we'll collect a fee there to pay to the local attorney that's helping coordinate that. So most agencies are collecting it in 2 or 3 big chunks, rather than having you pay out of pocket each time every little expense comes up. The benefit of doing that is it gives the surrogate confidence that those fees are being held, that you have the money to pay her for the journey, and you have the money set aside, and we're holding that in a trust account for you, that is then distributed based upon the terms of the carrier agreement like Vicky was talking about. And so then we'll take care of those payments for you so you don't have to kind of worry about this or that. Does that help?
Terrific. And escrow or a trust fund, those are services that some agencies have in-house and sometimes use a third party.
Yeah, that's right. Some agencies have those services in-house. Some use a third party. I think the one important piece for you guys is to make sure that that money is being held in some sort of secure account. The one that most agencies use is called an IOLTA account, which is IOLTA. It's a specialized escrow-like account for lawyers to hold client funds. And what that means is if someone comes and sues the agency, that lawsuit cannot attach funds that are being held in an IOLTA account, so your money is truly secure. There are agencies out there, I believe, that hold the funds in a checking account, which is a horrible idea because if they get sued, they can come after all those funds that they've set aside for you in a journey. So make sure that your funds are held in a truly secure account.
Terrific. And of course, a lot of that is really done to protect the surrogate, because if you all of a sudden lose your job or something, and she's already pregnant, you can't really reverse that. So that's a very important, we think, an ethical aspect of the process. So when we look at this list, Sam, we know that people will ask you questions, and many of the answers will be it depends, and it's hard. I know some agencies have a policy of having the escrow account take a lot of contingencies and be really very high. Others are trying to be more realistic about it. But how do you guide the intended parents about all those unpredictable costs that depend on so many things? And what may they ask you in order to try to find maybe a surrogate that would have the least amount or the least likelihood of many of those costs materializing?
Yeah, great question. So, what was the first part of that again? Sorry. It was, how do you estimate the? Yeah. So, I think as you guys are looking at agencies and assessing, which provider is going to be the best agency for you, I think Ron hit on it early on. This list is actually a pretty good list of different costs that could be associated with the journey that you might or might not encounter. The numbers on the left or on the right, I think, are less relevant than the actual topics covered in each subcategory. And so as you look at an agency and you look at their cost sheet, look to make sure that they are actually including all the costs that will be associated with the journey. The one I see most often as I look across the landscape of other agencies and the fees they put out there is they don't include any of the travel costs. Those costs will certainly come, and you will certainly have to be responsible for them to have your surrogate travel to and from the clinic once or twice. And some agencies don't put that on there because they're not collecting that fee. And so then their journey looks cheaper, right? Some agencies don't do the legal work, they outsource that, so that cost does not appear on the cost sheet. And so as you look at cost sheet to cost sheet, make sure you truly are comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges, because not every agency does the cost sheet the same way. I think that the folks sitting up here all have pretty comprehensive cost sheets that give a true picture of what the journey will cost. And I think that that's a great service to the community. Not every agency does that, though.
And sometimes people, we tell at least people that there might be some sort of ideal, if they're very budget conscious, there might be an ideal profile of a surrogate that if you were able to find that surrogate, and if they're willing to wait for that surrogate is likely to have lower fees or lower expenses associated. What would that ideal profile be?
Yeah, I think I would push back a little bit on this. I think a lot of people do come to us hoping to find the unicorn surrogate that lives literally right next door to their clinic and will accept compensation of $15,000 to do the journey. That is fairly unrealistic, to say the least. I think Vicky touched on this really well. There's a meritocracy of information out there with regard to surrogate compensation. I can go right now and look at 35 different agencies and see what they pay their surrogates. Surrogates can do the exact same thing. So if there's a surrogate out there willing to accept significantly less than kind of market rates, so to speak, that could be truly a unicorn. But I think what we see occasionally is it's actually someone who's maybe not all that qualified to be a surrogate, and they haven't been accepted at any agencies, and so they're willing to take a less of a compensation than other folks. And I'm excluding Canada here, by the way, because I know you guys do it a bit differently, so this is US specific. I think if you're looking to reduce costs in that arena, the best thing to do is try to find someone that is close to the clinic. That is realistic. It does increase time to match, right? I can find a surrogate that matches any criteria you want. It's just every layer of criteria increases the amount of time it takes to match overall. So I think that's one way to reduce costs. The other way is don't do twins. I mean, truthfully, like twins are going to drive up cost in really every element of the journey. That's difficult because I know that sometimes people feel like twins as 2 for 1. I think the risks of twins far outweigh the benefits. And I'm sure everyone on this panel has seen the twins that are born early and one passes away. And it's very rare, but it's just not worth it. And it drives up cost. So.
Yeah, we just had a GPAP couple that had their twins born at 22 weeks. One did not survive. They spent 2 months in another state, hoping, praying, and supporting the baby that did survive. And that, it happens rarely, but not that rarely. We know, we have the statistics. We also tell people that if they can speak to the agency and say whether they can try to find that unicorn, or that very rare surrogate that is a stay-home mom, but not with very young children, and that doesn't have a very high, or if she works, she doesn't have a very highly paid job because you will pay her for every day that she doesn't work, that has good insurance, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but also has maybe disability insurance that would cover the days she has to go on bed rest, or at least partially, and or after the birth. So, and maybe with a self-cleaning house or something, so they don't, or a very small house, it takes a lot of money to clean, because all those things you'll be responsible for. To clean her house, to watch after her children, to pay her for the time she doesn't work, to pay for her life insurance, all those things. So theoretically, there could be a woman out there that is on one side of the spectrum. And if you're very budget conscious, you could say, we're willing to wait a year. if you can just find us that woman. But of course, it is not always possible to find all those things and a woman that has the same vision about everything else we talked about yesterday. So before we move on to talk about insurance, because that is something that, you know, is its own category, I wanted to ask Leah Swamberg here on the panel, as we will, by the way, have a conference on October 27th, was that mentioned already, in Toronto about Canadian surrogacy. So those who are interested in surrogacy and want to also, you know, get deeper and maybe have a quick trip to visit and examine this close hand. In October 27th, we're going to have a one-day conference in Toronto just about Canadian surrogacy. But for now, since this is probably all, you know, a little different, can you just go quickly and not talk about the way the agency fees are different or the clinic fees are different, but just about those components, just saying the surrogate's compensation and her expenses, and briefly about also medical insurance situation in Canada for the surrogate and the newborns.
Sure, thank you. So for the surrogate's reimbursement in Canada, it is a reimbursement for expenses in which she provides receipts to her agency or directly to her intended parents if it's an independent journey, and she is then reimbursed for those funds. A first-time surrogate generally has her expenses capped at $20,000 throughout the journey, which looks a lot like what Vicky had said from confirmation of pregnancy onward. And that is in Canadian dollars. The one difference, though, is that you know, within the Canadian structure, the surrogate's bed rest is not capped, and so we go very in depth when you begin to review surrogate profiles to ensure that you understand what those bed rest costs could look like. We are very lucky in Canada to have a federally run program for employment insurance, and so if your surrogate is working, 55% of her wages are replaced by the federal government, but that remaining 45% would be up to you to provide either directly to her or through an agency should you work with one. One piece that we have seen in the last year that's been really exciting for us, you know, we, as many of you know who spoke to us at our booth, we have a single embryo transfer policy only. We have a 2% twins rate in our program that we're very proud of. For us, honoring the women that carry your babies is just such a priority to us that, you know, unfortunately the priority of twins, you know, is not a value that we share. However, insurance is now available in Canada for singleton babies. The surrogate is covered throughout the pregnancy by our social health care. Regardless of the amount of income your surrogate makes, she's covered by our social health. There is no way to opt out of our Canadian plans at this point, so she will be covered through the pregnancy. Your baby will not. There is a residency requirement in Canada that your baby will live in Canada in order to have insurance. So Allianz Worldwide has put a policy in place over the last year that we now have intended parents purchasing. If they choose not to, we ask them to sign a waiver setting out that they can take to their lawyer to really understand what costs they may be in for. We really want you to be educated, so to have the conversation with your lawyer, to have the conversation with other intended parents who have had children born prematurely about what that cost actually looks like. And we have a breakdown that we send to intended parents as well. That Allianz policy, we have seen on average cost the intended parents €4,000 as they are insuring themselves, and it needs to be in place at the time of the embryo transfer. Should that transfer not be successful, the policy can be canceled and reissued 30 days later. And then when your baby comes, should your baby come early, a policy can be put in place for your child, and the cost for that has been €2,500. And we have, in the last several months, finally had clients that required it, and Allianz has paid the hospital directly, and the intended parents have been quite satisfied with the service. Although it is a new service to us, we really encourage intended parents to ensure that they have insurance wherever it is that their child is being born. As we love to have you in our country. We love to have you work with our surrogates, but we really respect our social health care system and want to ensure that Canadians are still able to be surrogates for you.
Thank you so much. And as I said, more about that either in the Q&A session or on October 27th. So now let's all take a deep breath and dive into the Virginia's laughing. I think it's probably not as complex as it used to be in some ways, but it's a mixed bag. So first of all, actually, I just made a mental note to. Do everybody understand what bed rest is? Because I know it's been discussed. We will have questions later, but if there is a term that being used several times and you're not sure exactly what it is, raise your hands now already, okay? So if, because bed rest, for instance, is something that can happen also if you have a singleton. It can happen before birth, and it could happen after birth. So if the surrogate is being told by the doctor that she needs to stay in bed for a while, that is bed rest, and then she's losing time at work or needs assistance at home for cleaning and looking after her children. And that happens a lot. So let's now talk about insurance. So Virginia Hart from Art Risk is here with us, and you've been working with a lot of agencies and intended parents directly to help them with insurance needs associated with both the surrogates and the newborns and other related components. So can you first talk about, so that we just make it clear that we're talking about the difference between the challenges regarding to covering the surrogate and her health and her procedures and versus the newborn or newborns.
Okay. Covering the surrogates is actually, there's 3 different ways a surrogate can be covered. Oh, sorry. Oh, real close. Okay. Scary. Thank you. Appreciate the advice. Okay, so surrogates can be covered 3 different ways. One is either she or her husband has insurance through their employer, and that employer-sponsored insurance covers a surrogate pregnancy. Not every plan will do that. So if she is using her employer-sponsored insurance, you have to make sure that it's been verified that that plan will work for surrogacy. Way number 2 is Obamacare. Obamacare, open enrollment, only time during the year you can apply for insurance, with very few exceptions, is coming up. It's November 1st to December 15th, unless you're in California, because we like to be different. It's October 15th to December 15th, to January 15th. New York is a bit different, Massachusetts, but for the most part, those are the important dates. Or the third way is she doesn't have insurance, so you purchase a plan that's been created specifically for surrogacy. And that plan has some advantages over the other 2. It's a little bit more expensive, but it does have advantages. So those are the ways that you could cover your surrogate for her insurance. The newborn, very similar to Canada, there's 2 requirements to have insurance in the U.S. Number 1 is you are a U.S. citizen or have the legal right to live and work in the U.S. The babies are U.S. citizens, no question about it. But the parents, and the second thing is you have to be a resident. That's what gets you. The intended parents coming from overseas are not residents, and neither are the babies. Because as soon as they're healthy and can travel and have a passport, you're bringing them home. They need to see grandma. So it's very important to know that. As legally, the babies are yours when they're born, okay? We can't put them on the surrogate's insurance. It's called insurance fraud. We can't purchase a plan through the U.S. healthcare system. That's called insurance fraud. But we can use a plan through Allianz. So we have the capability to hook you up with Allianz and to sell you that plan to you, only for singletons. And as Leah said, it does need to be purchased right around that time of transfer. Very important. If you have twins, we also have a plan that was created for surrogacy, for international intended parents, The premium and the deductible is going to be about $80,000. So you need to think really long and hard about, that's almost a second journey, right? Also, we have a plan, if you miss the deadline for the Allianz plan, we also have a plan for singletons, but again, it's about $20,000, so you're looking at more money. But there is definitely a difference between what you can do for the surrogate and what you can do for the newborns.
So Allianz doesn't have a plan for the surrogates?
Yeah.
Sounds like that would be a good deal. Because so let's just go back to explaining. Once again, I know many of you are in countries where there's a national health system. So when we talk about costs, for instance, Leah was talking before about costs of premiums of 4,000 euros and 2,500 euros, respectively. Are those costs similar to for the United States and Canada?
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
Exactly
it has
the
to
same.
do, the rates are set based on the age of the intended parent and the country where they reside.
Okay, not where the
Not
surrogacy
where-
or the baby is born. And the other question, is just so that to explain, whenever there are premiums, there's also levels of deductibles or co-pays or other self-pay components. Can you just explain that? Because I don't know if that's always the structure in the United States. So by paying the premium, you're not done. Can you explain first about the Allianz and then about the other range of solutions we have for the surrogate herself? The dynamics of premium versus copays and deductibles.
Okay, so if you haven't stopped by our booth, stop by because we have this great piece of paper that defines insurance terms in the US because it's alphabet soup. It's PPO, HMO, it's very confusing. So go pick that up. But with insurance, we have two things in addition to premium that you may have to pay. The first is called deductible, and that's the amount that you pay before the insurance company pays anything. So if you have a $2,000 deductible, you're going to pay $2,000 first. Once your deductible is met, you may have what we call co-insurance, where you pay a percentage, say 20%, and the insurance company pays 80% for a while until you reach the out-of-pocket maximum. And that is the most that you have to pay in any given year for in-network covered services. So you might have a $10,000 out-of-pocket maximum. You might have a $5,000. With Allianz, you can kind of pick and choose what you want. You can decide to have a higher deductible or a lower deductible. The lower the deductible, the higher the premium. It's just an inverse. So that's, you can decide. You can have actually no deductible with them, and they start paying the first dollar. So there you will have choices, and you'll be given those choices by Allianz before you buy the policy.
And that is, it goes back to what we said yesterday, that one of the things you need to think about before you start this process is what is your risk tolerance. Just kind of like, look at yourself for a few weeks and try, if you don't already know yourself well enough, are you the kind of person who's going to want to have a high premium but have the peace of mind that you're capping your out-of-pocket in a certain way, or are you the kind of person who, optimistic and thinks, let us take a little more of a chance, or something in between? And you already mentioned that there are timing associated with the Affordable Care Act and when you can get Allianz. There is also something that sometimes people, strategy that I know used to be the strategy, maybe it's no longer, of having more than one insurance, one that you hope you'll need and one that should only kick in as a secondary insurance, backup insurance. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
So insurance in the US can change every year. So if I start a journey with a surrogate and that insurance is supposed to cover her surrogate pregnancy, and January 1 comes and her employer has changed insurances and now her insurance doesn't cover, what do you do? So we have a plan we call our backup plan, and it costs roughly $2,000, and it is in place just in case. It's really insurance on your insurance for those people who are very risk adverse or risk adverse at all, or just don't trust insurance companies, which is a smart move. So you want to make sure that you are covered, because if her insurance changes and you didn't know about it, or I looked at one the other day that the agency had no idea her insurance changed. Clueless. Luckily, we're coming into open enrollment. But she's 4 months pregnant and really has no insurance to cover that. Now, they had a backup plan, and so we just say, okay, well, then this plan's going to step up and become the primary plan. When you do so, you pay additional premium and additional deductible, but it's going to be less than what the medical bills are. So it makes a good sense to do that, because that way your exposure is covered.
And maybe going back to what we said before, you might not know exactly what, at the time you sign up, what insurance the surrogates, well, not you might not, you will never know. At the time you sign up with an agency, what will be the insurance particulars of the surrogate you will end up being matched with. But just as we said before, if you're very budget conscious, you could, once again, try to have this time versus money trade-off and ask your agency, given their experience, if I'm willing to wait 6 months more, will you be able to make sure that you find a surrogate for me that has a better insurance? As Virginia was saying right now, that could be a little bit of a goose chase, in the sense that she might have a good insurance now, but then she or her husband may lose their job or something like this, and the insurance would change. But I think it's still worth it to try. To ask, you want to say something about that?
I see most of the better agencies, most of agencies will do an insurance review and will know what the surrogate has prior to being matched, because they want to be able to present you someone who is qualified. So they know that her insurance is going to cover, because as Ron has said, that really factors in. It can swing the cost of a surrogacy $25,000, $26,000, $27,000 easily. So it's important to know that insurance piece when you go into a match.
So I want to open this to any additional comments from the panelists first, and then we'll take some questions. But if there's anything you thought, maybe other strategies or other points of view regarding insurance or other experiences, we'll do that first, and then we'll take a few questions. So go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I think that Virginia hit on this a little bit, but the insurance cost is an independent cost from the agency, right? So if you have an agency saying, oh, I can get insurance for you for $4,000 or $5,000, like, look, let's just, like, we all are working in the same insurance markets. We all know the insurance policies that are out there. Make sure you're really doing your homework, because I've certainly seen that on cost sheets, and I just know it's not true, right? And we always want to find the best insurance we can at the most reasonable cost for intended parents. It's in everyone's interest. So I think that's accurate, right, Virginia?
Yeah, I was just going to say that regarding whether or not the surrogate's insurance would cover a baby, you're going to hear some talk about pre-birth orders versus post-birth orders, and the question comes up, oh, if I get a post-birth order, if I become the parent of my baby after the birth, can't I use the surrogate's insurance for the baby? Now, some people might argue that you can try to do that, and I'm not going to say one way is right and one way is wrong, but I'm also going to say just be extremely careful with that rationale, because the insurance companies can deny, even if you get a post-birth order. They can say, no, you have a contract saying you're the parents, you are the parents, we're going to deny. And so there's no panacea regarding post-birth or pre-birth orders. You always have to anticipate the worst and it's like a puzzle. I always tell people it's like a puzzle, the insurance. And we work with Virginia's company, Art Risk, quite often, and they do insurance reviews. They actually call the insurance company, and the options for newborn, what Virginia's presenting, are very sound, and I think that's why this is a good panel for you. So that's what I wanted to say.
And really, if you wanted to try to do anything on the cheap, I would highly recommend that it's not the part that involves understanding and evaluating your insurance options, because as I mentioned, until you have surrogacy available in your home country and covered by the medical health system you have, you have to deal with complexities, especially in the United States. One last word before we take some questions is that when it comes to the insurance situation, especially if sometimes we do try to use the insurance of the surrogate, and we think that that's an insurance that typically would cover her costs, sometimes insurance companies would just play hard and then say, this is, they find other reasons to try to deny, even when we think that a reasonable person wouldn't. So at the end of the day, some of it also depends on the way you conduct yourself at the hospital, the way there is, the way the administrative staff there, records things, and just remember at the end of the day, everybody is a person, and you can try to smooth things out a bit. Sam, you wanted to say something about that?
Yeah, to make a comment on that, I think what we've seen is, look, insurance companies don't like to have surrogates on their insurance. It's something they like to exclude. And so we've seen, and I'd love your feedback if you've seen this too, and you, Virginia, as well, we've seen more and more insurance policies that cover maternity care but have a surrogacy-specific exclusion. So it's really important that you get an expert opinion on whether the surrogate's insurance will actually cover maternity care. Even then, once that judgment has been made by someone such as Virginia's team, or we have people in-house that do it. I don't know if you do as well, but yeah, you do. That sometimes it still gets denied. So there's some agencies out there that have legal expertise in-house that then will fight an appeal for you with the insurance company. And so think about, as you're signing up with your agency, do they have the expertise that if you end up needing that service, they can fight the appeal for you, because it is important. And sometimes insurance companies, as Ron said, they deny it for no real good reason, just hoping you won't fight. And usually when you fight, they cave and have paid. At least in our experience, that's been the case.
Well, I thank you very much, the panelists. Thank you very much.